Hello, and welcome to Breaking Down History. My name is Mr. Pritchard,
And I'm Dr. Dickens.
and hopefully today we're going to be breaking down some history for you. What this is a video or podcast that we're going to put out once a week, or in your case for Year 9, once every 3 weeks, where we are breaking down different bits of world history, something that we think is interesting, something that hopefully you will find interesting as well, and it will also tend to be something that you maybe haven't studied before.
Now, in today's episode, we're going to be looking at modern dictatorships, and we're going to be trying to answer the big question: how do dictatorships actually work? Now, as we're going through this, to make it worth your while, make sure that you're taking some notes. They can be in any format whatsoever. You can be taking notes in bullet points, you can be doing mind maps, diagrams, whichever way suits you best. But to get the most out of this, you will need to be taking some notes as well.
Okay, so our big question is, how do dictatorships actually work? But I think it's important we ask the first question, which is, what is a dictatorship? How would you define a dictatorship?
Well, absolutely. Now, dictatorships are defined generally by a few different features. One of the most important features is that dictatorships tend to have one leader or one governing party. Now, in the case of one leader, these are often referred to as strongmen. Governing parties tend to be things like communist parties or fascist parties. Another feature of dictatorships is that they're modern. And what we mean by that is that they tend to occur in the 20th century. Now, actually, if we look at countries before the 20th century, we find lots of different features of dictatorships in those countries as well. So, for example, before 1900, very few countries had anything that we would really call a democratic system. Very few people had the vote. And often these governments were quite repressive. But actually, the phenomenon of modern dictatorships really takes hold properly in the 20th century. And finally, dictatorships are geographically diverse. And what that means is that you find dictatorships across the whole world. If you take a look at that map, you've got dictatorships which are occurring not only in Europe, but also in Asia, in parts of Africa, South America, Central America. And that is just a small selection of dictatorships in general.
So, really interesting that it happens all over the world. Is there a reason why dictatorships tend to happen in the 20th century and why they weren't happening before that? Is there...
There's a few different reasons. In the 20th century, we have a lot of upheaval, which means a lot of violent change, which causes some dictatorships to emerge and to take place. But one of the main reasons why we don't see modern types of dictatorship before the 20th century is that the sort of work that governments do and how they do their work changes. So that in the 20th century, we have governments which are able to control populations in a way which governments before the 20th century just weren't able to do. And we'll show you these in a moment.
Right. So what would be some examples of dictatorships then?
Well, we've got some really obvious examples. So when people talk about dictatorships, they often refer to, for example, the Soviet Union, the USSR, fascist Italy, the 1920s, 30s, and Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And also places like communist China, which became a dictatorship in 1949 and is still existing as a dictatorship today.
And some of those, I'm guessing, you would have already studied, so maybe looking at Stalin,
Yeah,
Soviet
absolutely.
Union, or Hitler is the most obvious example.
Exactly,
for Germany.
yeah. But we've also got some examples which aren't so obvious as well. So some smaller countries which are dictatorships, and some of these dictatorships which are still active at the moment. In East Africa, a country called Eritrea has essentially been a strict dictatorship since the early 2000s. Now, Eritrea is an extremely secretive country in East Africa. It's sometimes called the North Korea of Africa. Now, since 2002, it's had no functioning parliament, and that's meant that the President Isaias, has been in pretty much full control of the country. Now, according to the United Nations, Eritrea is involved in torture, kidnapping, forced labour, execution, all as a way of controlling its population. And this makes it actually one of the most unpleasant dictatorships in the region. But the thing that really marks it down is compulsory military service for all men. And what that means is that as soon as you become of age, as a man in Eritrea, the army can call you up into the army and can force you to fight. And you can stay in the army for a lifetime. There's no limit on the amount of time that you can be held in the army in Eritrea. We've also got some other examples. So one example which people may be aware of is the Philippines, which was run by a man called Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, Ferdinand Marcos was known as a pretty unpleasant, brutal man. But one of the most interesting aspects of his dictatorship was the role of his wife, Imelda Marcos, who was known to be active in supporting Ferdinand Marcos, but also was famous for her love of shoes. And she developed and built up a collection of thousands of shoes, which can be seen in a museum today. And one example which I do particularly like is the example of Bhutan, which is another secretive country, this time in Asia. Now, Bhutan was essentially a dictatorship up until the year 2007, when it started holding elections. But it's what we might call a benevolent dictatorship. The dictatorship there was often concerned with really improving people's lives. And actually, Bhutan became famous for trying to make its people happy. Now, it doesn't always succeed in this, certainly. It is still a dictatorship, so many people are not necessarily particularly happy with the system of government. But Bhutan measures its success as a country by how happy its people are, not by how much money it makes or how much influence it has around the world.
Okay, so we've looked at some different examples of dictatorships. I guess the common thing we had across all of them was the use of sort of terror and force, and pretty horrific in some cases, especially Eritrea. I'd never heard of that dictator before. What actually happens in order for a country to become a dictatorship? How does a country go from being a democracy or having a king to having a dictatorship? What's the process there?
Well, there's a few different reasons why countries became dictatorships in the 20th century in particular. One of the most obvious reasons is economic crisis. Now, the main economic crisis in the 20th century was the Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted actually all the way up until the Second World War. And as a result of the Great Depression, Germany in particular moved towards becoming a dictatorship under the Nazis. The Nazi party in Germany found their support massively increased during that period.
So what you're saying there is there's a link between countries becoming poorer and people becoming poorer, and then I guess moving towards more extreme parties, or extreme parties taking advantage of that.
Yeah,
so basically poverty is a key cause of those two issues.
Yeah, and one of the reasons is that extreme parties like the Nazi Party went out and they promised that they would make people's lives better. And if you're desperate, then you may well follow those ideas and those promises.
So is it fair to say, by that logic, that you'd be unlikely to see a dictatorship if you had a successful, wealthy country? You're not just going to have a dictatorship springing up out of nowhere. They tend to respond to desperate events.
Generally, they do, certainly.
Fantastic.
Now, another of these desperate events can be war. The obvious starting point for lots of dictatorships in the 20th century was the First and the Second World War. Now, after the First World War, Russia had a revolution, or was involved in a revolution towards the end of the First World War. And the old monarchy, the old king in Russia, was overthrown and replaced by a new dictatorship under the Communist Party. Now, this dictatorship turned Russia into the Soviet Union, and that country lasted as a dictatorship all the way up until 1991. There are more recent examples as well, though. So we've got, for example, the war in Iraq. Now, if you speak to a lot of political analysts, people who look at how and why politics change in the world, they'll say that the war in Iraq recently was one of the main reasons why groups like ISIS came about. And that in turn has allowed them to set up their own dictatorships in that part of the world.
So essentially, after a war or after there's a time of sort of turmoil, certain strong leaders step up to deal with the problems that the war has created.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we were going to look at dictatorships as a whole, is there something that they all believe in? Do they have a sort of common set of values, I guess you could say? Is there something that links them all?
Well, the obvious thing that dictators and dictatorships believe in and agree with each other in is that there shouldn't be democracy. So they're not interested in other people having a say. They want to control their own countries pretty much fully. But actually, beyond that, there are different types of dictatorships and different types of beliefs. We'd call them ideologies that dictatorships might follow. One of these beliefs or ideologies is communism. Now, the Communist Party was obviously the party in charge of the Soviet Union and in countries in Eastern Europe after the Second World War as well. And the key idea here is that everyone should be equal. Might seem a bit strange, but these dictators who wanted to control their populations and make sure that other people didn't have any say in what happened in the countries, they actually believed that everyone should be essentially equal to each other. Now, as well as communism, there are also dictatorships which have other ideologies, one of the main examples being fascism. Now, fascism was invented by a man called Benito Mussolini, who became the ruler of Italy in the early 1920s. And what Mussolini essentially said was that countries should be strong, they should be powerful, and they should be led by one particularly strong, powerful individual. Now, good news for Mussolini, that strong, powerful individual turned out to be him. Now, fascism inspired not only people in Italy, but also dictators in Germany and elsewhere. So, in particular, Adolf Hitler could be considered part of the fascist movement. We also have ideas of religious extremism. Now, certain religious leaders have been very interested in establishing dictatorships so they can force people to follow particular aspects of their religion, often in quite extreme forms. And one current example, or very recent example at least, is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS, which in certain ways can be considered a modern dictatorship, like various others. One strange, perhaps, ideology that some dictators have also believed in is the idea of economic liberalism. Now, what that really means is that people should be free to make lots of money if they want to. Now, that idea is quite common to our society in Britain and America, amongst other countries, and they aren't dictatorships. However, some economic liberals have tried to set up their own dictatorships in order to force that idea through. And one example is General Pinochet in Chile, who was dictator in Chile during the Cold War. In fact, Pinochet's ideas of economic liberalism fitted quite well with ideas in other countries like Britain and America. And he was actually quite close allies to the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at the time and to Ronald Reagan in the United States as well.
How do dictatorships control their populations? Is there a way in which they control the people that they're living under? Because they're not all believing in the same things. Surely they must be at least managing the people in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's a few different ways. One of the most obvious ways that dictatorships use to control their populations is fear and terror. And that can be clearly seen in a few different examples. Okay, so let's take a look at the example, for example, of Nazi Germany. Germany between 1933 and 1945 was under the dictatorial rule of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party used various organisations to instill fear and terror in its population. Most obvious was the Gestapo. Now, these were the secret police. They wore plain clothes. They would come round, they would arrest opponents, people who opposed the Nazis, at night.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a way of ensuring that, first of all, opponents would disappear. They'd no longer be on the scene. But also, it would spread the impression that anyone could be arrested at any time for almost no particular reason. And this is one of the main reasons, perhaps, that the Nazis were able to keep control of the German population, because everyone was in a state of what we would call terror. Everyone was afraid that they could be arrested.
And I guess if you've got people in plain clothes, you don't know who to trust, you don't know who the informants are in society.
Exactly.
Are your neighbours maybe telling the police about you? Are there people in your family? That's how this idea of fear works within the society.
Yeah, certainly. Now, fear and terror wasn't just used in Nazi Germany. We've also got the example of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there were a series of organisations, secret police organisations, which existed from 1917 onwards. The first of these was called the Cheka, which was, again, the secret police. And this was set up in 1917, and it lasted through until the early 1920s. And the Cheka arrested and killed political opponents of the Communist Party. Now, what we see actually in the Soviet Union is that once the Cheka has been dissolved, once it no longer exists after 1922, different secret police organisations are set up to take its place. So in the 1930s, the secret police in the Soviet Union was called the NKVD, and they went out and they arrested specifically opponents of the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. And then from the 1950s onwards, there was an organisation called the KGB, which was, again, a secret police organisation which arrested opponents of the Communist Party. And I wonder, actually, Mr. Pritchard, whether you know which famous Russian politician came from the KGB.
Yeah, I do. The topless Russian leader that is Vladimir Putin,
Yeah,
head of the
indeed.
KGB, isn't he?
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking, if we go so far, we've had the terrorising of the public and the sort of instilling fear in them, but also what you've referenced with Russia and the Soviet Union is the elimination of opponents. So not just controlling the people, but getting rid of potential threats to the government.
Absolutely.
So those are our two key features so far.
Yeah. Now, fear and terror is still used by dictators today to control their populations. And it's important to remember that we've still got dictatorships which exist in the world today. One of the most obvious examples, perhaps, might be North Korea. Well, in North Korea, the government has been accused by the United Nations and groups like Human Rights Watch of using fear and terror in a way which is designed to control its population. So Human Rights Watch, which is an international human rights organisation, in 2017 released a report which said that the North Korean government, restricts all basic civil and political liberties. In other words, it stops people from expressing their freedoms in society and prohibits any organised political opposition, independent media, civil society and free trade unions. And what that essentially means is that if you're living in North Korea, you aren't allowed to set up any organisations which might challenge the North Korean government, the communist government in North Korea, for power. The North Korean government has also been accused of using torture, forced labour and execution to maintain fear and control. So this is something that still exists in the world today.
And so we're talking about here complete lack of freedom for the people of North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next thing we're talking about is propaganda. This is something that I imagine most people will be familiar with. How do you describe propaganda? What is propaganda to start with?
I suppose the best definition of propaganda would be any material which is created in order to influence the way that people think in a society. And
so what examples would you have of that?
Well, it's very often used by governments. So if you think, Mr. Pritchard, if we go back to the general election last year in Britain, what did you see all over the streets?
So you've got billboards, posters. If you turn on the TV, I guess you've got advertisements. So newspaper articles, all sorts of things.
Yeah, and what are these designed to try and do during the election?
Persuading and informing, not informing, actually persuading people
Yeah.
of a certain opinion.
Yeah, absolutely, and trying to get people to vote for a certain party.
Right.
That's a form of propaganda. But in dictatorships, propaganda often takes the form of really much more extreme messages and much more extreme ways of influencing people's opinion. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. And one of the examples is propaganda from the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was really, really interested in controlling and manipulating how its population thought. And in the 1930s in particular, people were fed propaganda through posters, through newspaper articles about the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. And the emphasis of this propaganda was to show Stalin as someone who was a strong leader, but also someone that people could trust and would support. So we've got the poster here of Stalin being greeted by the children of the Soviet Union. And what do we notice about Stalin in that picture? What's interesting about that?
I guess I always think this about propaganda. You've got these horrendous regimes where people are being terrorized and tortured, but if you were to look at the posters, everyone's happy, everyone's smiling, everyone's looking at Stalin and whoever it might be with such sort of admiration. It's almost such a contrast to what you tend to naturally think of when we think of these types of countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the other thing I'd point out here is if you look at Stalin himself, he's larger than life, isn't he? He's almost superhuman. And he's watching over the people of the Soviet Union. Watching over them, according to this propaganda, with a smile on his face. He seems like quite a nice guy. If you've ever studied Stalin, you'll know that's not necessarily the case. But this is the message that the Soviet Union was trying to get across. And actually the text there says, thank you to our great leader Stalin for the happiness of, or for a happy childhood. So children are crediting Stalin, according to this propaganda, for making their lives happy.
So would you have just seen this in the Soviet Union, or would you have seen this in other countries as well?
Now, actually, propaganda we have in all sorts of different countries. So let me give you another quick example. This is a piece of propaganda from, I wonder if you can guess which country.
Oh, I want to say North Korea?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, North Korea. Now, this shows North Korea's founding leader of the Communist Party. And again, you can actually see it's very similar to that picture in the poster of Stalin. You've got the leader who is smiling, they're happy, they're what we might call benevolent. So they're looking out for the welfare of their people.
Is he meant to be the son in that cartoon?
It's a very good question. It certainly looks like that might be the impression.
If he is meant to be the son there, he's almost some sort of Teletubby-like leader of North Korea. You know?
I'm sure you'll be getting a phone call from the North Korean embassy soon.
Fine. I just think that looks a lot like what you see in the Teletubbies. You know, big face in the sun. Everyone's looking up at him. Yeah. You've got the 4 Teletubbies beneath him as well. Yeah. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
Well, it's interesting pointing out that people are looking up to him because this does create the impression again, just like in that propaganda picture of Stalin, that you've got people in the Soviet Union, or in North Korea in this case, who are really being guided and looking for inspiration to their leaders.
Right, so we've looked at sort of the communist dictatorships, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
What about more right-wing dictatorships?
Well, there's still, again, different types of propaganda that these dictatorships use, but I want to turn our attention actually to a different way that dictatorships control their populations, and this is through popular organisations. Now, when we're talking about popular organisations, we don't necessarily mean organisations that lots of people like. We don't mean necessarily popular in that sense of the word. But we mean popular as in organisations which attract a lot of people or have lots of members. And one of the things that dictatorships have done very successfully across the world is create organisations which actually involve ordinary people so that they can get the support of people from within their own country. Now, actually, this is a bit like the flip side of fear and terror. On the one hand, these countries are trying to control and terrorise their populations. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they're also keen to give the impression that they have the support of ordinary people.
So it's sort of like a carrot and stick type thing. On one hand, holding out a hand to sort of bring these people on board, to win the people of their country over, but at the same time, this very stern hand that can be brought down to strike fear into the people of
Exactly,
right.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some examples. In Nazi Germany, between 1933 and 1945, there were organisations for young people, in particular the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. And both of these had big memberships, and they were aimed really to get young people involved and following Nazi ideas. In the Soviet Union, we have something very, very similar. So the Soviets had their own youth organisation called the Komsomol. And the Komsomol was the Communist Youth League. And what it did was really encourage young people to get involved with communist ideas and communist politics, really as a way of getting the government that support from those young people.
Right, so those are some of the organisations. How any other ways in which they controlled populations, dictatorships control populations?
Yeah, let me give you another way, and this might surprise you a bit. It's not the word that we'd expect to associate with dictatorships, but some dictatorships use elections to control their populations. Now, that might sound really weird because we usually think of elections as something that we have in liberal democratic countries, right, where everyone has a vote.
So people get to choose their leader. So surely that wouldn't work in a dictatorship. Surely people would just vote for whoever the dictator wasn't. Another alternative.
Well, you would think. And it raises the question, why would a dictator bother to hold an election if they're the ones that are going to keep all the power? But the funny thing is, in almost every dictatorship, you have some form of election which often takes place. Now, there's a big risk in this. If you're a dictator, obviously, you're going to try and make sure that you win that election.
Yeah.
And you're not really going to be interested in whether people really want to vote for you at all. But you're going to make sure that they do, or give the impression they do. But there's still a risk that you could lose the election, or at least not win the election as comfortably as you expected. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Do you remember a man called Ferdinand Marcos that we mentioned before?
Yeah, the leader of the Philippines.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in 1986, Ferdinand Marcos held an election, and he was absolutely certain he was going to win it really, really comfortably. We've got a picture of Ferdinand Marcos just popping his vote into the ballot box.
Yeah, looks like there's lots of sort of happy Filipino voters behind him. He's about to win this. I'm guessing that's what you're going to tell me. He won a landslide election.
Well, if you'd asked him on that day, I'm sure he would have said confidently, yes, I'm going to win a landslide election. Unfortunately, what actually happened is that he won the election, but actually by quite a narrow margin. In other words, he didn't have a very big majority. And people in the Philippines started to say, hold on, why can we trust that this man even won the election at all? Maybe he didn't. And as a result of this, people started to protest, and Marcos was forced from power. So there is actually a big risk. Now, the flip side of that is that if you manage the risk well, and if you can win elections effectively, then dictators seem like they've got what we call more legitimacy. And what that means is that it seems that people support them. It seems that they're the right people to run the government. And we've got some really clear examples of this. So in Nazi Germany, the Nazis continued having elections, even though they'd already banned all other parties after 1933. And 1936, there were elections to the German parliament. Now, of course, there's one party which is allowed to stand in this election, which is the Nazi Party. And they made sure that everyone turned out to vote. So, according to the Nazis, 99% of all Germans who were allowed to vote came out and they voted.
So that's one of the things I remember when I learned about the Nazi history. Some people would say, well, the Nazis won, they were elected into power, the German people chose them. And I guess if you look at that election, you could believe that, couldn't you? But is that the real story?
Well, actually, once the Nazis were in government, they could control the way that politics worked. So they didn't allow any other parties to exist in Germany.
Right.
So this was an election with one party, and I'm sure you can guess the outcome as a result. Everyone had two choices. Either they vote for the Nazis, or they spoil their ballot, which basically means you put a big cross through your ballot paper or you rip it up, and that counts as a non-vote. So, as a result, the Nazis, the only party who anyone can vote for, they win every single seat in the German
Surprising
parliament.
that, isn't it? It's amazing how that
happened. Now, actually, the Nazis did this quite well in Germany in 1936. But just 50 years later, East Germany had a different type of dictatorship, what we would call a communist dictatorship. And in East Germany, the Communist Party tried to control Germany partly by having elections as well. Now, the interesting thing is, if we think back to the Nazi Party, in the 1930s, they were the only party which was allowed to exist in Germany. In East Germany, under the communists, there were officially other parties that were allowed to exist. So the main party was called the SED. Now, this was the Communist Party, the Socialist Unity Party it was called. But there were also other parties which were part of what was called a national front. And the deal was that these parties could exist provided that they agreed with what the SED said.
Right.
So they agreed with Communist Party policies, and they entered into a coalition with the Communist Party. In other words, they couldn't stand in elections independently by themselves. They had to be part of a bigger grouping which included the SED.
But surely that would mean that East Germans wouldn't have voted for them. Surely they wouldn't have seen any purpose in voting for that party.
Well, it's perhaps a good point, except the SED was always the biggest party in the National Front, and the Communist Party, the SED, made sure that it would stay the biggest party in the National Front.
I see.
And just like in Nazi Germany, they also made sure that people came out to vote. So, fairly big turnout. In 1989, in the local elections, according to official results, 98.85% of East Germans voted for parties which were part of the National Front. But this actually caused a big problem for East Germans. Lots of people started saying, it can't possibly be the case. We hate the SED, we hate the National Front parties. We can't possibly have voted for them. And this outcome was disputed. People actually went out onto the streets and they said, we disagree with this result. We don't think that the Communist Party should have won this election. And we want free and fair elections where, in fact, any party can stand and they don't have to be part of this National Front. Now, this wave of protests which began actually led to the downfall of the Communist Party in East Germany, because people went out onto the streets, they started protesting, and it all ended up at the end of 1989 with people tearing down the Berlin Wall, which you can see on that picture there. And that was the symbol of the communists controlling East Germany, and they've gone.
So where you've got elections massively paying off for the Nazis and Hitler, actually we've got two examples of elections being this incredibly risky way of controlling your people.
Absolutely.
So you kind of asked the question of why you'd bother hosting them in the first place if they're going to backfire in this tremendous way.
Yeah.
So why do dictatorships in history matter? Why are they important?
Well, there's all sorts of different reasons that we could give, but actually I think this is a really current and important topic, really for three reasons. First of all, if we look at where dictatorships are in the world, if you remember back to the beginning of the podcast, we were saying they happen in all sorts of different countries across the whole world. Now, because different countries became dictatorships in different ways, and they tried to control their populations in different ways, if we look at dictatorships in the 20th century, we can actually work out how different countries developed and how they changed during that time. A second reason is that until very recently, historians tended to assume that dictatorships might be a thing of the past, that they might be dying out. Now, actually, lots of people are starting to say, not really the case. Lots of people are starting to say countries are still turning into dictatorships. And, well, you might know a few examples where people are...
You mentioned Eritrea, and obviously we've got North Korea and the Philippines, and a modern example of almost becoming a dictatorship. again, having sort of left a dictatorship behind in the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the example of Russia as well. Now, Russia was a dictatorship all the way up until 1991, when the communists ruled Russia. And then it became a democracy. But recently, people have started to look at the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and say, well, hold on, he's acting like a dictatorship again.
Right.
So there's a possibility that democracies can turn back into dictatorships once again. And actually, this brings me on to the third point of why this all matters. It's actually quite useful knowledge. If we know how democracies can start to turn into dictatorships, if we can work out the different reasons why this might happen, well, perhaps we'll be in a better position to identify the possibility of this happening in the countries that we live in, and perhaps even combat that and make sure that it doesn't happen in our own country.
So if we see, for example, horrendous examples of propaganda or a secret police being formed by Boris Johnson, who knows? So these are the type of things we're meant to be looking out for.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. Right. Okay, so to sort of conclude, how do dictatorships work then? What are the sort of key things we're saying, the key features of all these different dictatorships around the world? What do they have in common?
Well, I suppose the key features, certainly the ones that we've looked at, dictatorships are undemocratic and they try to control their populations, often with fear and terror. And remember, we looked at that issue of the secret police coming up in all sorts of different dictatorships around the world. But it's not just that. We've got to remember as well that dictatorships often have some level of support from the people that they try and control. And they have these popular organisations which they try to use in order to make sure that people will follow their ideas and buy into their ideas. And of course, we've got the example of elections, which, as you pointed out, are a really dangerous way of trying to keep control of people. But they do crop up in dictatorships over the world. We do have what are called these sham elections, so elections which are sort of set up, designed to allow dictators to win.
I guess the key point you've really made here, and I think this is the problem that maybe sometimes we oversimplify dictatorships and we say, right, they're all using terror, they're all using fear. Actually, it's multi-layered. There's lots of different ways, different means of control, and it's not really a simple one thing that dictatorships do. It's much more complex than that. Right. Okay, so what we would like you guys to do, our key question here is sort of how do dictatorships actually work? And we'd like you to have a think about that, whether that's you now discussing with maybe someone else who's listened to this with you, maybe having a discussion with your parents, maybe writing a little judgment, how do you think dictatorships actually work? What are the key reasons why? Or maybe just making some more notes, adding to what you've worked on so far. But we'd really like to hear from you, so write us an answer or compose something and get back to us and let us know how dictatorships actually work. We will see you in a couple of weeks' time where we'll be discussing another element of dictatorships and looking at people that actually lived under them. Okay, thank you. See you later.
See you later, guys.